This week, our topic of focus will be on non-native species and whether or not they should have a place in conservation. In this video, we will define what we mean by a non-native species, as well as some other related terms. Let's start with what we mean by a non-native species. Non-native species refers to any species that has been transported outside of the environment that it evolved in. It's any species that has been brought to a new place or new habitat by people, either on purpose or by accident. There are also a number of different terms used to refer to non-native species, including alien, exotic, and introduced species. While there are some nuances to these different terms, for the most part they are used interchangeably. So how do non-native species get introduced to new environments? How do humans move other species around the world? Let's split the different ways into intentional and accidental introductions. First, we'll look at intentional introductions. Sometimes humans transport species to new regions on purpose. This may be done for economic reasons, human enjoyment reasons, or an attempt to address some environmental problem. Economic motivations have historically been perhaps the most common motivation for introducing a species into a new place. For example, many species have been introduced for the purposes of agriculture or aquaculture. In North America, soybeans, wheat, apples, honeybees, and all livestock except for the American bison and turkey are non-native species. Think about what the average North American diet would look like without soy, wheat, beef, chicken, or apples. We're heavily reliant on non-native species in our agricultural sector. Species have also been introduced to support human recreation activities. A number of fish and game animals have been introduced to new lands for the purposes of sport hunting and fishing. For example, here in Nova Scotia, white-tailed deer were introduced to the province in 1894 near Lake Jolly in Digby County, following a lot of lobbying from sport hunting groups. By 1904, the deer were thriving and found in all parts of the province, and the first official white-tailed deer hunting season was in 1916. A number of plants have also been introduced with the intent of aesthetically improving public recreation areas or private gardens. For example, pictured here is the Norway maple, which is one of the most common trees planted on Canadian city streets, but as you may have guessed from its name, it is not a native species to Canada. Rather, it was introduced from Europe in the mid-18th century as an ornamental plant. It's important to note that sometimes species were introduced in order to improve the landscape or for cultural nostalgia reasons. This was common in North America during the 18th and 19th centuries, as settlers sought to bring familiar organisms to the New World. In some cases, the reasoning was to bring a little bit of home to the New World for nostalgia reasons, like bringing a particular variety of rose to have in the garden. But in others, it was because European plants and animals were viewed as superior to the species that were encountered in North America. For example, starlings are a really common bird across North America, but they're actually native to Europe. They were originally introduced to North America in 1890 by Eugene Schieffelin. He was the chairman of the American Acclimatization Society, which over the course of a few decades brought hundreds of plants and animals from Europe to the United States. In the case of the starling, they were brought because Schieffelin was a huge fan of Shakespeare. So he had all of the birds mentioned in the works of Shakespeare brought to the United States. Of these, the starling was by far the most successful, as originally 80 individuals were released in New York City's Central Park, but today there are over 150 million of them on the continent, and their range has expanded to now span all the way from Alaska to Central America. Finally, some species are introduced with the aim of rectifying some environmental problem. For example, kudzu, a plant native to Eastern Asia, was introduced as a means of erosion control on farms across the southern United States. But it rapidly took hold and earned the nickname the vine that ate the South. Other species are introduced with the goal of using them as a sort of biological control agent on some problem species. The theory is that by introducing a natural enemy of the target species, you'll be able to reduce its number or control its spread. For example, after alligator weed was introduced to the United States and began to spread rapidly, it was controlled through the introduction of the alligator weed flea beetle, which feeds on the weed in their native range in South America. More often than not, a species is considered to be native to a particular area if it was there at the time of European colonization, and it's deemed to be non-native if it arrived after colonization. But it's important to point out that humans have been moving other species around the planet for as long as we've been mobile, and many species were introduced to new areas centuries or even millennia before colonization. For example, corn or maize was first cultivated over 5,000 years ago by the Maya, Aztec, and Inca peoples in Central America. By the time colonizers reached the shores of the Americas, the crop had spread across the continent, becoming one of the three sister crops alongside squash and beans, which were important to a number of different indigenous nations, including the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations of the Mississippian Valley and the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin further north around the southern Great Lakes. People have also been moving plants and animals across not just continents, but across oceans for millennia. For example, coconuts were first domesticated by peoples on the islands of Southeast Asia during the Neolithic era about 12,000 years ago, before they were taken from island to island by people across the Pacific all the way to Panama and across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar. Sweet potatoes were originally cultivated by people in Central and South America around 4,000 years ago, but from there it spread across the Pacific via the transoceanic trade of the Polynesian people, reaching places like Easter Island, Hawaii, and Aotearoa or New Zealand by the 13th century. The point is that species introductions by humans is nothing new. It's been going on for thousands of years. It's just that these exchanges of plants and animals between continents increased dramatically post-European colonization. For example, potatoes were introduced from their native South America to North America and Europe in the 1500s, and going in the other direction, plants such as wheat, lettuce, grapes, and sugarcane were introduced to the Americas. But not all species introductions by humans are done on purpose. Sometimes species are introduced to new areas by a complete accident. As long as humans have been moving around the planet, we have brought with us accidental hitchhikers. For example, the Norway rat has achieved a near global range by becoming a stowaway on ships, spreading out from its native range in northern China and Mongolia to Europe in the Middle Ages and onwards to the Americas and Australia during the Industrial Revolution. Today, the only contiguous rat-free areas in the world are the continent of Antarctica, the Arctic, some isolated islands, and certain conservation areas of New Zealand. Basically, anywhere you can find humans, you'll find the Norway rat. Other species, like scorpions and spiders, are sometimes transported far outside their native range in shipments of tropical fruit. For example, the false widow spider, which is native to Madeira and the Canary Islands, is now found throughout most of Europe, the United States, Chile, and Colombia, among other countries, having arrived in shipments of bananas. Some species become accidental introductions when an intentionally introduced species carries a parasite or herbivore with it. For example, when oleander was first brought to North America as an ornamental plant, the oleander aphid accidentally came with it, hiding out in the plant's leaves during the journey. And it's not just terrestrial plants that have been moved around the planet by hitching rides on ships. There are numerous examples of marine organisms being transported in the ballast water of ships. One example is a zebra mussel, which is native to southern Russia and Ukraine, but is now found throughout the Great Lakes, where it has become an invasive species. Over time, some non-native species may become naturalized. Naturalized species are non-native species that manage to successfully establish a new population in their new environment that does not need human help to reproduce or maintain itself over time. Naturalized is commonly used to refer to non-native species that have become established but do not disrupt its new ecosystem in order to distinguish them from invasive species, which we'll look at on the next slide. Some examples of naturalized species in Canada are shown in the photos here. From left to right, we have sweet clover, tiger lilies, and common mullein. Invasive species are species that dramatically disrupt the communities and ecosystems of their new environment, causing ecological and/or economic damage. It's important to note that oftentimes in the conservation literature, Non-native and invasive species are terms that are used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. Remember that a non-native species is simply any species that is outside of the range that it naturally evolved in. But an invasive species is one that is able to become established on many sites, grow quickly, and spread to the point of disrupting plant communities or even entire ecosystems. While many invasive species are non-native, not all non-native species will become invasive, and in some cases, even a native species can become invasive. Though this is rare because ecological systems usually have some mechanism built into them to control a species with the potential to become invasive. However, if something like a key predator is removed from the system by humans or some other means, all bets are off, and the species may be able to become invasive and further disrupt the system. An example of this is the purple sea urchin, which decimated kelp forests along the Pacific coast after its natural predator, the sea otter, was hunted to near extinction. Some examples of non-native and invasive species that are wreaking havoc on Canadian ecosystems are zebra mussels and purple loosestrife. Zebra mussels are perhaps one of the most notorious aquatic invasive species in Canada. First introduced to the Great Lakes in 1988 by the ballast water of ships, they now cause hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage each year as they multiply quickly and clog intake pipes and sink navigational buoys. They also consume huge amounts of phytoplankton, which affects the local food chain, and they also aggressively crowd out any other substrate organisms, like native freshwater mussels, whose populations have been dramatically declining ever since the arrival of zebra mussels. Purple loosestrife seeds were in the soil that was used as ballast in ships and discarded in North America sometime in the early 1800s. Since then, it has spread rapidly across the continent in wetlands, floodplains, and damp roadside ditches, where it aggressively chokes out native vegetation and causes habitat loss for many wetland fish and bird species. The presence of non-native species, especially naturalized ones, but also invasives, has led to the creation of novel ecosystems, which we'll discuss in more detail in a later video this week. A novel ecosystem is one that has been heavily influenced by humans, but is not under direct human management. So a working tree plantation wouldn't be considered a novel ecosystem, but one abandoned a few decades ago would. A forest dominated by non-native species would also count, even if humans have never cut it, burned it, or even visited it. Although nobody knows exactly how much of the Earth is covered by these novel ecosystems, researchers at the University of Maryland have estimated that about 35% of the planet is comprised of novel ecosystems. And as human influence on the planet continues, it's likely that this figure will only increase in the future.